I'd like to start today by sharing two things with you. And the first thing is a picture that came to my mind once when I was doing a silent retreat. And the picture was really simple. It was of a pair of binoculars. When you shut one eye and looked through one of the lenses, you saw the world as it generally appears to us and to people around us. When you shut the other eye and looked again, you saw the world as it appears to God when God looks at it. The question is, what happens when you open both eyes and look through both lenses at the same time? Seeing both of these images superimposed on each other. Do you get cross-eyed? Do you experience double vision? Or do you see the world in an extra dimension, the world as it is, but with hidden depths? So I just want to leave you with that image for a moment, and then I want to share another thing. Now, this is something that you all, or almost all of you, have already read this week because it's in the AGM report. And just to remind you, this is some lines in Howard's report, the Rector's report from last year, and I just want to read them. There are many challenges facing the church and therefore our parish in the 21st century. The world is moving away from the shape of a community formed by the vision of God's kingdom as proclaimed by Jesus. We seem to be living in an age when strong, rich, strident individuals wish to enforce their own individual outlooks onto the rest of society, with little concern or care for the poor, the powerless, and the disabled. Disciples of Jesus Christ in the coming days will need special training, encouragement, and inspiration to confront these forces. Now, it strikes me that our three readings today invite us to think about exactly these questions. What does the world generally look like to our contemporaries? What does the world look like to God? And how do we stand in the gap? Because there is a gap. What responsibilities do we have? And what resourcing do we need? What kind of special training in order to do what God is asking of us? So first, let's turn to our gospel from Luke. This, of course, is one of the most famous passages in the New Testament. Or is it? Because actually, the one that people mostly think of is the one in Matthew's Gospel, which comes at the start of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you are being really attentive, you'll see that Luke's sermon is given on a level plain. So this is known as the Sermon on the Plain. We're not talking about Qantas, by the way. And Bible scholars point out, as many of you will know, but when Matthew and Luke were writing their Gospels, they most likely had access to a common source, a source which are the sayings of Jesus. And you can tell which ones they are because anything that's not in Mark's Gospel, but is in both Matthew and Luke, probably came from a compilation of Jesus' sayings that was then used by both of the Gospel writers. So Matthew and Luke have got a lot in common, but also some differences. And here is one of the most significant differences. Luke's version of this passage is very, very different from Matthew's. And it fits with Luke's theological themes and Luke's take on what Jesus' mission and vision actually was. Thinking back, in recent months, we've had a lot to do with the Magnificat in Luke 1, the Song of Mary, where God puts down the mighty and raises up the lowly. And the sign of this is the birth of a defenseless baby. And then in Luke 4, which we've had twice in the last month, Jesus' mandate for mission, good news for the poor, which he proclaims and then nearly gets lynched straight afterwards. And it's important to remember that Luke is a political realist. and that the society of Jesus' day was radically unequal, much more so than ours, divided between rich landowners, which you hear a lot about in the parables, and poor labourers. And Jesus was a country boy. He knew about these things. He grew up in them and with them. So how is Luke's vision then different from Matthew's? Well, it's a revolution. It's a vision of the world turned upside down. It's a world in which the people who are now poor, hungry, weeping, and hated receive two things. They receive a blessing right now, and they also receive a promise of future hope. But it's also a world in which those who are now rich, full, happy, and praised by everyone will experience, as Luke says, woe. And maybe they've already got all of the blessings. Maybe they've grabbed them. And maybe there are no more in the stock. But what's interesting here is that Jesus blesses the poor in the present tense, but the promise is a future one. So there's a real distinction, there's a gap there between what Jesus' good news for the poor is today and the promise of what will be fulfilled. And so the people Jesus is blessing are invited to believe, to trust, and to hope, while continuing to live in unjust circumstances. And we know that though Jesus is highly political, his solutions are not political ones. Jesus did not come to lead a revolution and to overthrow a government. Jesus called for a transformation of the world, but which is a different kind of transformation. So Jesus' hearers are invited to live with a kind of double vision, seeing the world as it is today and living in the light of the world which is to come that Jesus promises. The reason they can do this is because in Jesus they've already got a foretaste. They've got a down payment. In Jesus the kingdom is already here. And it's interesting that all the miracles in the Gospels are most often referred to not as miracles, but as signs. The reason these stories of miracles are included is not to encourage people to seek magic solutions to their problems, but as a sign that God can be trusted to do what he promises. They are signs of who God is. But they're signs which are not apparent to everybody. And as we know from the Gospels themselves and from our own lives, this promise of future hope has not yet been fully realized. God knows we know that, all of us. For those of you who like theology, there's a posh word for this. It's called partially realized eschatology. So there'll be a test after the service. But like most long theological terms, they can be translated into plain English very easily. We live in the gap between what already has been done by God and what God has not yet done but has promised. That's the gap we live in. Now, 1 Corinthians gives us another example of double vision. Paul, in our reading from Corinthians, is talking about the foundation of Christian hope. And just like in Luke's Gospel, he draws a really clear distinction. Our hope as Christians, says Paul, is based on something that is not obvious to our contemporaries. It's based on something without which our faith makes no sense, and we seem, frankly, ridiculous. It's based on something without which our faith, says Paul, is futile, without which our sins are not forgiven after all, and we are of all people most to be pitied. What is this thing? This thing is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. It's the event which opens up a future for us that goes beyond what we can see in the world. It's a future in which, as Paul says in Romans, nothing in this world, not even death itself, can separate us from the love of God. And it's the event that we celebrate, especially at every Eucharist, and that we also experience as a kind of down payment, a foretaste, in every little resurrection in our own lives. Each little miracle of forgiveness where there didn't appear to be any hope, of reconciliation where there was division. Each little sign of a world made new. So Jesus' promise is of a world turned upside down, and of a love that's stronger than death itself. And we who gather today, we who follow Jesus, have had a foretaste of what that means. But in our own experience, these things have only been partially realized. And they're far from apparent to everyone. And if we're honest, it's not always easy for us to maintain this double vision, this hope. It's funny, isn't it? One of the most helpful theologians of the current day, I think, is a guy called Tim Minchin, who many of you may have heard of. And one of the reasons I like Tim Minchin is because he reminds us how outrageous it is to be a Christian. As Christians, we need to remind ourselves that some of the things we cling to, we hope, we believe in, are not supposed to be that obvious. Actually, they're quite scandalous. Doesn't mean they're not true, but it means that to believe them is frankly a bit of an ask. And there are days when I wake up and I think the resurrection of Jesus just seems to me completely implausible. If I'm honest, and I'm sure that other people in the room will say the same if they're honest. Doesn't mean I don't believe it's true, but at the same time, it's something so outrageous, actually such good news, that I find it hard to believe. So what can we do about that? How can we live in this gap between what seems obvious to our contemporaries and the Christian hope which we've tasted, to which we've committed ourselves, most of us here, all of us here maybe, I don't know. So to quote Howard, what kind of training, what kind of encouragement, what kind of inspiration do we need in order to maintain this hope in 2019? How can we build our muscles of faith and hope? Well, look, I'm not here to solve all these questions. Part of the fun of my job is I get to ask questions and then I get to leave you with them. And of course, this is something we can all think about over the coming weeks and months. At the AGM today, at the planning meeting that's coming up, as we listen to God during Lent, as we seek God's will for the future of our community. But I am going to give you one hint and then one specific question. And back to our reading from Jeremiah. Incidentally, it's very important to realize that in the Old Testament, at least in my reading of the Old Testament, cursing is something that comes about because people are reaping the consequences of their own actions. We believe in a God of love. We do not believe in a God who curses people. At the same time, it's a very strong way of expressing a reality. And the reality in Jeremiah's text is that if we separate ourselves from the source of life and hope, then we will experience that separation as a form of cursing, because we are cutting ourselves off from blessing. For me, that's all it means. And Jeremiah gives us an image of two trees in a parched land, which those of us who live in Australia will understand better than many people who live in England, where I'm from. The thing about these trees is that at first sight, both of them seem to be okay. They're just there growing in land that looks pretty dry. But actually, only one of these trees is equipped to deal with the heat of the desert. Only one of these trees is planted by streams of living water. Now, the hint I want to give you is this. Actually, the tree planted by the water is not asked to work any harder than the other tree. The tree planted by the water is not asked to take any responsibility for the water flowing down the river. The role of the tree planted by the water is essentially a passive one. It's grounded in the right place. All it needs to do in order to bear fruit is to abide there, to absorb what is being given. And maybe that's all that God is asking of us today, to build ourselves up as a church community, a community of faith. Maybe all we need to do is to abide, to go to the source of living water and to absorb it, as the Psalms say, to spend time just pondering what God has done. So that's the hint. And the question is simply this: where are you planted? What do you absorb during any given week? And where does it come from? What are the sources that nourish you? And are they as nourishing as they appear? Because in a world where the presence of the risen Christ is not obvious, there are a lot of parched places and uninhabitable salt lands. They might look attractive, but they do not feed our souls. So maybe the question that God is asking you today is, how are you going to take time to abide in God, to absorb his presence, to ponder his word, so that you too may not be anxious in an age of anxiety, and so that you too, and we as a community, may not cease to bear the fruit of Christian hope. Amen.